Victor Langford slammed the folder down so hard the coffee mug rattled off the edge of the desk and shattered on the floor. Nobody moved. 12 ranch hands standing in that cramped office went absolutely still, the way livestock goes still when they sense something dangerous nearby. "You signed it," he said, and his voice was almost gentle, which was worse than if he'd screamed. "Every single one of you signed the new wage agreement. That means this month's payroll is what it is. You don't like it. The gate's open." One man, older, sun-weathered, missing the tip of his left index finger from some machinery accident nobody ever explained, raised his hand halfway, then seemed to think better of it. Victor looked at him anyway. "You got something to say, Curtis?" Curtis put his hand down. "No, sir." Nobody said anything. And that silence, that particular brand of silence that lives somewhere between fear and shame, told Adeline Mercer everything she needed to know about Iron Creek Ranch before she'd even unpacked her suitcase. If these men who had worked this land for years couldn't speak up, what chance did she have? If you've ever watched someone powerful crush someone powerless with a smile on their face, you already know exactly where this story goes. And if you've ever been the person standing there with your hand halfway up, then this story is about you. Don't go anywhere. Subscribe to the channel right now and follow this story all the way to the end, because what happens next will leave you breathless. Hit the like button, drop a comment with the city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning. Adeline Mercer arrived at Iron Creek Ranch on a Tuesday, which she would later think was fitting, because Tuesdays were the most forgettable day of the week, and she herself had become, in the past 14 months, a woman the world had largely decided to forget. She was 47 years old. She had a worn leather suitcase with a broken wheel that she dragged rather than rolled. She had a bookkeeper's certification, 11 years of clean accounting work, and a reference letter from a man who'd since died, which meant she couldn't even call him to verify it was real. She had $63 in her checking account and about $400 in cash tucked into the inside pocket of her coat, which she kept buttoned regardless of the temperature. What she did not have was a husband. Daniel Mercer had died 18 months ago. Not from illness, not from any of the quiet, dignified causes that people can frame and set on mantles. He had died because a man named Gregor Paulson had convinced them both, actually, that their retirement savings belonged in a private land investment fund that turned out to be nothing but a hole in the ground with a professionally printed prospectus stapled to it. Daniel had been the trusting kind, the kind who believed men when they shook hands. He had signed the papers while Adeline was at work, trying to surprise her, and by the time she found out what he'd done, their savings were gone and Daniel was gone 2 months later, a heart attack at 61 that the doctors called natural causes, and that Adeline would spend the rest of her life believing had more to do with grief and humiliation than with anything wrong in his chest. She did not blame him. That was the thing. People always got wrong when they looked at her, when they tried to read her face 4 traces of anger. She was not angry at Daniel. She was angry at the shape of a world that let men like Gregor Paulson exist and thrive and retire to a house in Scottsdale, while the people they destroyed kept dragging broken suitcases from one job listing to the next. The Iron Creek Ranch position had come through a regional placement service that specialized in rural and agricultural businesses. The listing had been almost comically sparse. Bookkeeper needed. Remote location, Montana. Housing provided. Immediate start. No salary listed. No name for the employer. Just a phone number and instructions to call between 7 and 8 in the morning only. She had called. A man with a smooth, practiced voice had answered and told her the position paid $3,200 a month plus room and board, that the previous bookkeeper had left due to personal reasons, and that her background check had already been processed, which she found strange because she hadn't submitted to one. When she pointed this out, the man on the phone laughed pleasantly and said they used a third-party service, very routine, nothing to worry about. She should have hung up. She knew it. Even then, some back part of her brain where her mother's voice still lived. If something feels wrong, Addie, it probably is. But $63 is a powerful argument against caution. She took the job. Victor Langford met her at the ranch's front entrance in a truck that cost more than her car had before she'd sold it, and he was exactly what the voice on the phone had promised. Smooth, pleasant-looking, the kind of man who kept himself just maintained enough to seem like he wasn't trying. 50-something, silver at the temples, a belt buckle that was either silver or something that really wanted to be. He shook her hand with both of his, which she'd read somewhere was a dominance gesture, and then he smiled like he'd just thought of something funny that he decided to keep to himself. "Adeline, welcome to Iron Creek." "Mrs. Mercer is fine," she said, before she could stop herself. His smile didn't falter, but something behind it did. Just briefly. Like a door swinging shut in a drafty house. "Of course," he said. "Mrs. Mercer." He showed her the ranch in a driving tour that took 25 minutes, narrating with the particular enthusiasm of a man who wants you to be impressed before you've had a chance to ask questions. The land was beautiful. She registered that distantly, the way you register that a hospital has nice flowers, but her attention kept snagging on details he glossed over. A barn that looked newer than the others by 15 years, easy. A fenced parcel off to the north with no cattle in it and no visible purpose. 3 vehicles parked behind the equipment shed that were registered, she would later find out, to businesses she'd never heard of. He showed her the office last. It was a converted room off the main house, with 2 filing cabinets, a desk, a laptop that ran Windows software, so old it had stopped receiving security updates in 2019, and a printer that made a grinding sound every time it warmed up, like an animal that had learned to expect pain. The previous bookkeeper, her name was never mentioned again after that first day, Adeline noticed, had left the files in a state that could charitably be called disorganized and less charitably called designed to discourage examination. "Everything you need is here," Victor told her, with the easy confidence of a man who didn't expect her to actually need much of it. "Any questions? You bring them to me. I keep an open door." "What accounting software does the ranch use?" "We use a proprietary system. I'll send you the login details." "And the ranch's ownership structure? Is there a parent company or—" "Everything runs through Langford Operations LLC," he said, still smiling. But there was something underneath the smile now that Adeline catalogued carefully. "I'll have the documentation on your desk by morning." The documentation never arrived. Her room was in a small guest house 50 yards from the main building. It had a space heater that clicked all night and a window that faced east, which meant she was awake at 5:30, whether she wanted to be or not. She used those early hours. That had always been her secret, unremarkable weapon. She was the kind of person who actually used the time other people wasted. By the end of her 3rd day, she had identified 47 transactions in the payroll records that didn't add up. Not off by a little didn't add up. Off by a mathematically impossible margin didn't add up. Names on the payroll that she couldn't match to any employment contract. Contracts with dates that preceded the LLC's registration by 2 years. A fuel account with charges that exceeded the ranch's entire fleet capacity by 40%. She sat at that grinding old printer on the 3rd night and printed nothing because she didn't trust the paper trail. Instead, she started a handwritten ledger in a notebook she'd bought with her own money at the gas station in town. Every discrepancy, every impossible number, every name. She was on her 4th page when she heard footsteps on the gravel outside. She closed the notebook and slid it under the desk mat without looking like she was doing it, a skill she'd developed without ever intending to. The footsteps stopped, then moved away. When she looked out the window, she saw a figure walking back toward the bunkhouse. Not in a hurry, just walking, with the unhurried gait of someone who wasn't trying to be seen, but also wasn't afraid of being seen. Average height. Work jacket. The kind of walk that comes from years of covering uneven ground in the dark. She didn't think much of it then. Ranch hands moved at all hours. That was the nature of the work. She met Rowan Hale the next morning while she was trying to figure out why the fuel line on the accounting records showed a maintenance service company that, as far as she could tell, didn't have a working phone number. She'd gone out to the equipment barn because she thought maybe a physical invoice would be tacked to something. That was the way some rural operations still worked, paper pinned to a board, a physical record that nobody thought to sanitize. And she found the barn empty except for one man crouched beside a tractor with a wrench, and an expression like he was having an argument with a machine he knew he was going to lose. "Sorry," she said. "I'm looking for maintenance invoices, physical copies. Would those be kept out here, or—" He looked up at her, and she had the strange sensation, which she would not let herself romanticize later, of being actually looked at. Not assessed, not managed, looked at. He was maybe 50, maybe a few years either side, with a face that had been rearranged by weather and work into something that didn't bother being handsome and wasn't trying to be anything else. He had the kind of eyes that made you think of someone who'd read more books than he let on. "Maintenance invoices for what?" he said. "The fuel account, a service company called High Plains Equipment Services." He was quiet for a moment that lasted about 3 beats too long for someone who didn't know what she was talking about. "Never seen a paper invoice for those," he said. "Everything would be in the office system." "The office system shows a phone number that's been disconnected." Another pause. He turned back to the tractor. "Might want to check the county records office," he said, and his voice was completely level, the way voices get when someone has made a decision about what they're going to and not going to say. "Old ranch equipment services, sometimes the county permits will have contact information." "That's an interesting suggestion for a ranch hand," she said. He didn't look up. "I've been around a while." She watched him for a moment, then walked back toward the office. Halfway across the yard, she stopped. She could have kept going. The sensible thing was to keep going. She turned back. "What's your name?" "Rowan," he said, still not looking up. "Hale." She wrote it in the notebook that night at the bottom of page 4 and put a small asterisk next to it. Not because she thought he was dangerous, because she thought he might be important, and she had learned, the hard way, to track things before they became urgent. Victor found her in the office on her 5th evening, after most of the ranch had gone quiet. She'd been cross-referencing the land transfer documents. There were 3 of them, recorded at the county level, all dated within an 18-month window, against the payroll for the periods in question, because something about the timing kept nagging at her the way a sound you can't identify will nag at you until you find it. He came in without knocking, which she suspected was intentional, and stood in the doorway with that particular quality of casual that takes practice to perform. "How are you settling in?" he asked. "Fine," she said. She did not close anything or move anything. She'd thought about that. Moving things was an admission. "Finding everything you need?" "Working on it." He came into the room then, not all the way, just enough to make it his space too, and looked at the desk in a way that was meant to look like he wasn't looking at it. "You know," he said, "the previous bookkeeper had a habit of overcomplicating things, looking for patterns that weren't there. It burned her out." Adeline looked at him. "What was her name?" A small pause. "Ellen." "Ellen what?" "I'm not sure that's relevant." "I might need to reach her," Adeline said, "for context on the filing system." "She moved out of state," Victor said. "I don't have contact information." He smiled. "I'll try to find it for you." He would not try to find it. They both knew that. The smile was just the punctuation on something that wasn't a conversation at all, but a warning delivered in the vocabulary of pleasantness. After he left, Adeline sat very still for approximately 40 seconds. Then she opened the notebook and started page 5. "Ellen, previous bookkeeper, moved out of state, no contact. Victor, no last name provided, follow up." Her hand was not shaking. She made a point to notice that, and to be quietly grateful for it. The next morning, she found a handwritten note tucked under the wiper blade of the ranch truck she'd been assigned to use. No signature, just 4 words in careful block letters. "East fence, box, bottom." She didn't go immediately. She waited until mid-afternoon when she had a legitimate reason to check on the eastern fence line. The maintenance logs referenced a repair out there. And she drove out slowly, the way someone would if they were just doing their job. The fence post second from the end of the northeast corner had a hollow base, which she would not have noticed if she hadn't been looking. Inside was a metal box, the kind you'd use for storing small tools. And inside the box was a collection of documents that had been folded precisely and sealed in a Ziploc bag to protect them from moisture. She sat in the truck and read through them with the engine off and the wind moving across the fields outside, and her hands, she noted again, were not shaking. They were copies. Records of payroll transfers, going back 4 years, routed through 3 different sub-accounts before landing in what appeared to be a private account that had no association with Iron Creek Ranch or Langford Operations LLC. Amounts that, when she started adding them up on the back of a receipt she had in her purse, reached a total that made her press her lips together and stare at the fence line for a long moment. Over 4 years, someone had stolen from this ranch's workers and its owner to the tune of nearly $900,000. $900,000. She put the documents back in the bag. She put the bag in the inside pocket of her coat, which she kept buttoned regardless of the temperature. Then she sat there for another few minutes, watching the sky change color over the mountains, because sometimes your brain needs a moment to catch up to what your eyes have shown it. When she drove back, she took the long way. Not for any strategic reason, she just needed the extra 12 minutes to decide what kind of person she was going to be. She'd come here because she had $63 and a broken suitcase and nowhere else to go. But she'd been a bookkeeper for 11 years, and she knew what fraud looked like. She knew what it cost. She knew, better than most people in the world, what it did to the people it landed on. She thought about Daniel, his face when he finally understood what Gregor Paulson had done. The way he'd looked at the kitchen table, at the paper spread out on it, like he couldn't reconcile the world he thought he'd been living in with the one he was suddenly standing in. She pulled into the ranch and parked the truck and sat for one more moment. Then she got out, walked to the office, sat down at the desk with the grinding printer and the outdated software, and opened the notebook to page 6. She wrote the total at the top of the page and circled it twice. Then she wrote, "Someone put those documents there. Someone wants this found. Find them before Victor does." The wind had picked up outside. Somewhere across the yard, the lights in the bunkhouse were coming on one by one. Rowan Hale walked past the office window without looking in, and Adeline Mercer, who had buried a husband and lost a future and come to the edge of a Montana winter with $63 and a broken suitcase, turned to the next page and kept going. She slept 3 hours that night, maybe less. The space heater clicked in the corner like a metronome counting down to something, and she lay on top of the blanket fully dressed because some part of her brain had decided that being ready to move was more important than being comfortable. The documents from the fence post were tucked inside the lining of her suitcase, which she had unzipped at the seam and restitched with a needle and thread she'd bought at the same gas station as the notebook. It wasn't elegant. The stitching was uneven and slightly puckered, and anybody looking closely would see it immediately. But nobody looks closely at a worn-out suitcase belonging to a middle-aged bookkeeper who arrived alone with $63 and no particular reason to be interesting. That was the only advantage she had, and she intended to use it. By morning, she had made a decision that she recognized, even as she made it, as either very brave or very stupid, and she had stopped being able to tell the difference between those two things sometime around month 8 of the 14 months that had remade her into whoever she currently was. She was going to stay. She was going to keep working. She was going to be the most thorough, most unremarkable, most professionally invisible bookkeeper Victor Langford had ever made the mistake of hiring, and she was going to find every single dollar he had taken. The county records office was 40 minutes from the ranch in a town called Bitter Creek that had one diner, one hardware store, a post office with hours that seemed to be more of a suggestion than a commitment, and a county clerk named Marlene who wore reading glasses on a beaded chain and regarded Adeline with the particular wariness of someone whose job involved knowing everyone's business and trusting none of it. "Iron Creek Ranch," Adeline said, sliding her request form across the counter. "Land transfer records, the last 5 years." Marlene looked at the form, then at Adeline. "You with the ranch?" "I'm their bookkeeper." Marlene took the form with 2 fingers, like it might be damp. "Victor Langford know you're here?" Adeline held her expression steady. "It's a routine audit request. He mentioned the county office would have supplemental records." That part was a lie, and Marlene probably knew it, because Marlene had the look of a woman who had seen every variety of human evasion and categorized them all. But she also had the look of a woman who followed procedure because procedure was the only reliable thing in a world of unreliable people, and the procedure said that public land transfer records were public. She came back 22 minutes later with a folder. Adeline sat at a laminate table near the window and read every page twice. Then she photographed them with her phone, methodically, every page, front and back. Then she sat for a moment and looked out at the street and the hardware store and the one stoplight blinking yellow because it was past the hour when Bitter Creek bothered with red and green. 3 land transfers. She'd known about those from the documents in the fence post, but the county records showed something the photocopies hadn't: a 4th transfer. Smaller. A 14-acre parcel on the ranch's south boundary, transferred 18 months ago to a company called Clearwater Land Holdings, LLC, which had been registered in Delaware 4 days before the transfer was recorded. 4 days. She wrote the name in her notebook and took a photograph of the registration number. On the drive back, she passed the ranch's south boundary and looked out at the 14 acres that used to belong to whoever owned Iron Creek Ranch, and now belonged to a Delaware LLC that had existed for less than a week before acquiring it. The land was empty. Just grass and fence posts and a hawk riding a thermal about 200 feet up, not concerned with any of it. Victor was waiting for her when she pulled back into the ranch yard, which told her that Marlene had made a phone call. She'd considered that possibility on the drive back and decided it didn't change what she needed to do, only how quickly she needed to do it. He was leaning against the fence near the main house with a coffee cup, performing relaxation with the skill of someone who had a lot of practice performing things. "Heard you went into town," he said. "Supplies," she said, holding up the gas station bag she'd stopped for specifically for this reason. Inside, a box of granola bars, a bottle of dish soap, and a roll of paper towels. The most boring bag of supplies in Montana. He looked at the bag. "Marlene down at the county office called me. Said you were pulling land records." There it was. She'd hoped for 30 seconds more, but 30 seconds was a luxury. "Routine reconciliation," she said. "The asset register lists the ranch's total acreage. I needed to verify the legal descriptions match our internal records." "That's not part of your job description." "It's part of every job description when the books show land as an asset." She met his eyes and kept her voice at about the temperature of the air outside, which was 51 degrees. "If the legal acreage and the recorded acreage don't match, that's a liability issue. I assumed you'd want that caught early." He looked at her for a long moment. Not unfriendly. Worse than unfriendly, actually. Appraising. The way you look at something when you're deciding what to do with it. "Next time you want county records," he said, "run it through me first." "Of course," she said. She went inside and put the dish soap under the sink and ate one of the granola bars standing at the window, watching him walk back to the main house. She chewed slowly and thought about the timeline. He now knew she was looking, which meant she had less time than she'd originally calculated, and she'd already been calculating tight. Her hands were not shaking. She noted this again. She was beginning to think it wasn't strength exactly, more that she had already used up whatever it was that shaking was made of somewhere during those 14 months. And now her body had simply repurposed that energy for something else. Rowan Hale found her, or let himself be found by her, 2 days later in a way that was clearly engineered to look accidental. She had gone to check the fuel tank meter readings against the logbook, a legitimate task. Victor couldn't object to it, and he was already there, not working, just standing with his arms folded, looking at the fuel gauge with the expression of a man who wasn't actually thinking about fuel at all. She approached and did what she always did, started doing her job. Wrote down the meter reading, compared it to the log. "It's going to be 12% short," he said. She looked at the log, then at the gauge. He was right. "How do you know that?" "Because it's always 12% short, has been for 3 years. She wrote the number down. "Where's the other 12% going?" He was quiet for a moment, not the kind of quiet that meant he didn't know, the kind that meant he was deciding something. "There's an auxiliary tank behind the north storage building," he said. "It's not in any of the official records." She looked at him directly then. "Rowan, how do you know all of this?" He turned to look at her and something shifted in his face, not dramatically, just the way a room changes when someone opens a window slightly. "I pay attention," he said. "I've been here a long time." "You've been here how long exactly?" 8 years. "And in 8 years you've watched someone steal from this ranch and you haven't—" She stopped herself because that sentence was going somewhere more revealing than she intended. "I've been building a case," he said quietly. The words landed differently than they should have, given what she assumed he was. A ranch hand building a case. She tried to map that onto what she knew of him and found the edges didn't quite fit. "Against Victor," she said. "Yes. And the fuel records, the payroll transfers, the land, you know about all of it." "Most of it." She studied his face. "Where are you getting your information?" "Same place you are," he said. "The records. You just have access to the office system. I don't." "But you knew where the documents were." "At the east fence." A long pause. "I put them there." She absorbed that. The hawk from her drive back materialized in her memory, riding the thermal over the south boundary, not concerned with any of it. "You put them there," she repeated. "I needed someone to find them who knew what to do with them." He wasn't looking at her with anything she'd call warmth, exactly. more like careful evaluation. You went to the county office the next day. Victor knows, she said. He was waiting for me when I got back. I know, I saw. Something tightened around his eyes. You need to be more careful. You need to be more honest with me, she said, and her voice came out sharper than she intended, which was also more honest than she intended. Because I am sitting in that office every night building a case that, if Victor finds it, ends my job at minimum and at something worse at maximum, and I would like to know who is actually on my side before I go any further. The wind moved between them. Somewhere on the other side of the storage building, a door banged once and then was still. I'm on your side, Rowan said, and the way he said it, flat, certain, like a fence post, not pretty but solid, was the most believable thing anyone had said to her in a very long time. She went back to writing down numbers. Then tell me about Clearwater Land Holdings. His breath changed, just slightly. Where did you see that name? County records. 4th land transfer. 14 acres, south boundary, 18 months ago. She flipped to the right page in her notebook without looking. Registered in Delaware 4 days before the transfer. He was quiet for long enough that she looked up. His jaw was doing something complicated. That land, he said carefully, is not Victor's to transfer. I know that. Whose is it? He seemed to make a decision the way you change gears in a truck, not smoothly, but necessarily. Come find me tomorrow morning, early, before Victor's up. He started walking. And Mrs. Mercer, don't write Clearwater in that notebook again. She looked down at the page. Then she tore it out, folded it twice, and put it in her coat pocket with the things she kept buttoned close. Victor began assigning one of the other hands to tasks that kept him within sight of the office, which Adeline registered and did not react to. His name was Denny, 20-something, with the anxious energy of someone who needed to be needed by the nearest powerful person. He never spoke to her directly, just existed in her peripheral vision, moving boxes, checking equipment, doing small, purposeless tasks near the office window with a frequency that was not accidental. She gave him nothing to report. She worked the same hours, took the same routes, made the same coffee. She had moved the critical contents of her notebook to a system so old-fashioned it would never occur to anyone to look for it. She had memorized the key figures and was reconstructing everything in a second notebook she kept at the bottom of her suitcase beneath the restitched lining. The first notebook stayed on the desk, visible, with enough real but unrevealing work in it to satisfy anyone who picked it up and flipped through. She had learned this from Daniel, actually, not from his downfall, but from before it, from the years when he had kept his own books for the small electrical business he'd run for a decade before selling it. Always keep a working copy and a clean copy, he used to say. The working copy is for thinking. The clean copy is for showing people. She had thought he meant it professionally. Now she understood he'd meant it as a principle of survival. She thought about him at odd moments, not in a grief-stricken way. She had done most of that grief in the first 8 months, and it had not been elegant or bearable, and she had come through it the way you come through a long illness, thin and unsteady but still upright. Now it was more like tuning past a radio station and hearing 2 bars of a song you used to love. Quick, then gone. Then you kept driving. She kept driving. Rowan met her at 4:50 in the morning at the equipment barn, and he had a lantern instead of an overhead light, which told her he'd thought about whether to be visible from the main house. He had a folder with him. Not the copies from the fence post, different documents, older. She could tell by the paper quality and the font of the typeface on the official headers. He set them on the workbench. These go back further than what you have, he said. She looked. Original payroll records, hand-ledgered, predating the computer system Victor had installed, covering a period when someone had been paying 12 workers whose names didn't appear anywhere in the employment contracts she'd found. 12 ghost employees paid weekly for 19 months, draining an account that had been set up parallel to the main operations account. A parallel account, she said. Victor set it up 4 months after he took over managing the ranch. Used a similar account number, off by 1 digit. Payroll staff at the regional bank processed it as routine for over a year before anyone noticed. What happened when they noticed? The account was closed. The funds were gone. He paused. And the bank officer who flagged it retired 6 months later, moved to Arizona. She thought about the county clerk, Marlene, reaching for the phone before Adeline had even left the building. About Victor waiting in the yard with his performance of casual. About the way power didn't operate through dramatic confrontations mostly, but through small, frictionless applications of leverage. A phone call here, a retirement package there. A position opened up for a bookkeeper who was already desperate enough not to ask the right questions. She had asked the right questions. She just had to stay alive long enough to answer them. "How did you get these?" she said, holding up the older payroll records. "I've been collecting documents for 3 years," he said. "From where?" "From here. From county office. From people who used to work here and don't anymore." "Why not go to the sheriff?" He looked at her steadily. "The county sheriff's office has a deputy who co-signed one of those land transfers." She set the papers down. "Which one?" "The second one. 52 acres on the northwest boundary." He pulled one of her documents slightly toward him and pointed to a notary signature near the bottom. "Benjamin Rourke. He's been a deputy for 11 years. Victor goes fishing with him." She looked at the signature. She looked at Rowan. "And above the sheriff? State level?" "That's where it gets complicated," he said. "Tell me the complicated version." He leaned on the workbench with both hands. "The LLC that received the Northwest parcel, it has a silent partner. It's buried under 2 layers of holding companies, and I only found it because I know what I'm looking for." He paused. "The silent partner has a brother who sits on the State Agricultural Oversight Board." She absorbed this quietly. Outside, the sky was beginning to lighten, that flat gray preliminary light that comes before color. "So Victor has someone at the county level, someone at the state level, and someone inside this ranch keeping an eye on me." "Denny," Rowan said. "I know about Denny. He reports to Victor every evening, what you did, where you went, who you talked to. Then he's reporting that I'm a boring bookkeeper who eats granola bars and checks fuel gauges." Something happened at the corner of Rowan's mouth. Not quite a smile, more like the memory of one, briefly visiting. "That's not the worst strategy." "What does Victor actually know," she said, "about what I've found?" "He knows you pulled the land records. He doesn't know about the fence post box." "How do you know what he knows?" Rowan looked at her for a moment, and she thought, there is more here. There is a great deal more here that he is not saying, and whatever it is, it changes the shape of everything. She could feel it the way you feel a change in air pressure before weather, but he just said, "I pay attention." She let it go. For now. She was good at holding questions in reserve, which was maybe the most useful skill she'd developed in 11 years of accounting. The numbers don't run away. The truth doesn't run away. You come back to it when you can. She built the case the way she'd built every complex reconciliation in her career, from the outside in. Start with what can be independently verified. Work toward the center. Don't assume, confirm. Don't theorize, document. The forged contracts were the most dangerous discovery and the most critical one, because contracts with forged signatures were not accounting irregularities. They were crimes with victims whose names she now knew. She had cross-referenced the signatures on 3 employment contracts against the signatures on tax withholding forms the same employees had signed, and the differences were not subtle. Different pen pressure, different letter form proportions on the capital R and capital M. The signatures on the contracts were consistent with each other in a way that real signatures rarely are, because real people don't sign their names identically twice. She had photographed everything on her phone. Then she'd emailed the photographs to a personal account she'd created on her phone's data plan, not the ranch Wi-Fi, using a name she made up, because she did not fully trust that her own email was unmonitored, and she was not going to assume any differently. She thought about this as she did it, and did not feel paranoid, because paranoia is believing you're being watched without evidence, and she had plenty of evidence. The payroll theft was straightforward to document once she had the parallel account records Rowan had given her. Amounts taken, dates, the ghost employees, the duration. She ran the full calculation 3 times to be sure, because she wanted one number and she wanted it right. The total across all the payroll fraud was $412,000 over 4 years. Add the land transfers, 3 parcels at county-assessed values, which were conservative, and she was looking at another $560,000 in property wrongly transferred. The fuel skimming was smaller but consistent, and consistency mattered in court, which was where this was going if she had anything to do with it. $22,000 over 3 years routed through the fictional High Plains Equipment Services. She sat with the total on page 12 of her second notebook and looked at it for a long time. Just under $1 million. From one ranch? Over 5 years. From workers who made $35,000 a year if they were lucky? from land that belonged to someone she still didn't fully understand, managed by a man who had built a protective shell around himself out of relationships and favors and the particular cowardice of people who knew the right thing but chose the easier one. $1 million taken from people who couldn't afford to lose it. She thought about Gregor Paulson in Scottsdale. She thought about Daniel's face at the kitchen table. She closed the notebook and went to bed and slept for 4 hours, which was the longest stretch she'd managed since arriving at Iron Creek Ranch. Victor escalated. She had expected it and prepared for it, and it still hit her sideways because that was the nature of direct intimidation. You can know it's coming and still flinch. He called her into the main house office on a Thursday afternoon. Not a request. A summons, delivered through Denny, who knocked on her office door with the look of someone who wished he were somewhere else. Victor's office was decorated with the careful intention of someone communicating power to people who might otherwise question it. Framed photographs of him with local officials. A mounted set of antlers above the window. Furniture that was expensive in a way that wanted to be noticed. He gestured to a chair across from his desk. She sat. He stayed standing, which she recognized as a choice. "I've been thinking," he said, "that we might be moving you into a different role." She waited. "The bookkeeping has been well handled, but I'm thinking you might be better utilized in more of an administrative support function. Less in the financial records, more in scheduling and correspondence." "That would be a significant change to my job description," she said. "We adapt," he said pleasantly. "And my salary?" A slight pause. "Would remain the same." "Then I'm not sure I understand the benefit," she said. "For the ranch, I mean. You'd be pulling your most financially qualified employee away from the financial records." His pleasantness developed a hairline crack. "It's an operational decision." "Of course." She kept her voice measured. "I'd want that in writing if we're changing roles. For both our protections." The crack widened. He looked at her with an expression that had given up on pretending to be pleasant and was now working on something else. Not quite threatening, not quite. More like a man holding a leash and allowing you to see the leash. "Adeline." "Mrs. Mercer," she said. A long silence. "I want to make sure we're on the same page," he said. "I hope we are," she said. "I enjoy working here." She left him standing in his expensive office with his framed photographs and his mounted antlers, and she walked back to her office, and she sat down, and she typed 2 sentences into the computer in the ranch's official email system, for the record, to herself. "Mr. Langford proposed changing my role from bookkeeper to administrative support. I requested written documentation of any role change. No documentation provided." Then she sent an email to the personal account she'd created from her phone, reporting the same conversation in full detail, because she needed a record and she needed it somewhere Victor's hands couldn't reach. Denny watched her from the yard. She waved at him pleasantly. He looked away. She found Rowan that evening near the water troughs at the south end of the property, which had become, without any explicit agreement, their meeting place. Remote enough that Denny's casual surveillance didn't reach it. Visible enough that nothing about it looked like a secret. "He tried to move me out of the financial records today," she said. Rowan was checking the float valve on the trough and didn't look up immediately. "I know. Denny told him you wouldn't take the role change lying down." "Denny reported that conversation?" "Denny reports everything." "Then Victor knows I asked for written documentation." "Yes." She thought about this. "Does that make things worse?" Rowan set down his tool and straightened. "It makes him more careful, which buys you a little more time, actually. A careful man doesn't make fast moves. He's not going to wait indefinitely." "No," Rowan agreed. "He's not." He looked at her with that quality of assessment that she'd begun to understand was not distrust but calculation, the look of someone who was constantly measuring variables. "How much more do you need?" "The second holding company, the one with the silent partner. I need a legal name and a documented connection." He was quiet. "You have it, don't you?" she said. "I have most of it." "Rowan." She said his name with a weight she didn't normally put on it. "Whatever you're protecting, whatever reason you have for holding back, I need you to understand that I am running out of time to be cautious. He will move me out of that office, or he will let me go, or something worse. And when that happens, everything I've built disappears with me." She paused. "Unless you have somewhere it can go that he can't touch." The sky above the south boundary had gone the color of old pewter. The hawk was long gone. A dozen cattle stood at the far end of the field in the posture of animals waiting for weather. Rowan looked at her for a long time, and she could see it happening, whatever wall he'd been building or tending for years. She could see him standing at it and deciding something about its future. "My name," he said, "is on the original deed to this ranch." She held very still. "Not as a manager, not as an employee." His voice was steady, but it had something underneath it now, something old and tired and still, somehow burning. "Iron Creek Ranch belongs to me, Mrs. Mercer, every acre of it, and Victor Langford has been stealing it from me for 5 years. The wind moved across the field. The cattle didn't stir. Adeline Mercer stood at the south water trough on land that belonged to the man standing across from her, looked at him properly for what felt like the first time, and said the only thing that made sense. "Then why in the world have you been living in the bunkhouse?" And Rowan Hale looked back at her with the expression of a man who had been waiting years for someone to finally ask him that question, and said, "Because I couldn't prove any of it. Until now." She stood there for a moment after he said it, and the wind moved across the field, and the cattle didn't stir, and the sky kept doing what Montana skies do in the evening, which is turn into something enormous and indifferent that makes whatever is happening on the ground beneath it feel simultaneously very small and very urgent. "Because I couldn't prove any of it. Until now." Until now. 2 words that carried 5 years of weight. She thought about the bunkhouse. A single room, she assumed, with a cot and a hook on the wall for a jacket and maybe a window that faced whatever direction offered the least comfort. She thought about a man who owned every acre visible from where they were standing, sleeping in that room, waking up before dawn to work land that was his, taking orders from a man who had stolen it piece by piece, and she tried to understand the particular kind of discipline that required. The patience, the grinding, daily cost of it. She had been here 3 weeks. She was already stretched thin. He had been here 5 years. "Sit down," she said. "Tell me everything from the beginning." He didn't sit. There was nothing to sit on, but he leaned against the fence post and crossed his arms and looked out at the cattle, and he talked. Not the careful, rationed talking he'd been doing since she arrived, but real talking, the kind that comes out when someone has held something so long their arms have gone numb from carrying it. His father had built Iron Creek Ranch from 40 acres, and a loan he'd spent 12 years paying back. By the time Rowan's mother died, the ranch was 420 acres, debt-free, with a working cattle operation and a small but profitable hay contract with 3 neighboring properties. His father had run it until he was 71, and when his health began failing, he had brought in a manager, someone to handle day-to-day operations, while Rowan, who had been working in Billings, wrapped up a business consulting contract that was supposed to take 6 months and had stretched to 14. The manager his father hired was Victor Langford. "My father liked him," Rowan said, and the way he said it had something careful in it, the way you say something true about someone you've lost that you also wish were different. Victor had recommendations, references. He knew the right language: land management, cattle operations, revenue diversification. My father was tired. He wanted to believe someone competent had it handled. Rowan came back to the ranch 8 months after Victor arrived. By then his father had suffered 2 minor strokes and was spending most of his time in a care facility in Billings. Victor had established himself completely. He knew every hand by name, every account, every supplier. He had moved into the main house under the reasonable-sounding arrangement of being on call at all hours, which was what his father had apparently agreed to. "I should have looked harder at that," Rowan said. "When I got back and he was living in the main house, I should have—" He stopped, pressed his mouth together. "My father trusted him. I didn't want to come in and immediately undermine my father's judgment while he was lying in a hospital bed. So I asked questions, and Victor had answers, and the answers sounded right." His father died 14 months after Victor's arrival. The will was straightforward: Iron Creek Ranch, in its entirety, to Rowan James Hale. No conditions, no caveats. What was not straightforward was what Victor produced 3 days after the funeral: a management agreement, signed by Rowan's father, giving Victor operational authority over the ranch for a period of 10 years, with renewal options and a compensation structure that included a percentage of annual revenues. A legal document, notarized, bearing what appeared to be his father's signature. "I knew it wasn't right," Rowan said. "My father would never have signed something like that without telling me. But he'd had the strokes. His signature had changed. And Victor had a notary and a lawyer, and the kind of quiet confidence that makes you question your own memory. Rowan had hired his own attorney in Billings. The attorney reviewed the agreement and said it appeared valid. Said challenging it would be expensive and uncertain, and would require proving the signature was forged, which meant handwriting experts and depositions, and a process that could take years while Victor continued running the ranch, and Rowan continued not running it. I didn't have the money for that fight. Not then. He said it without apology, but not without pain. My father had put everything into the land. The liquid assets were minimal. To hire the experts, fund the litigation, I would have had to borrow against the ranch itself, against property that was tied up in the legal dispute. It was circular. So Rowan had made a decision that he knew, even making it, would cost him things he couldn't predict. He had come back to the ranch, not as the owner. Victor's lawyers had made clear that his operational authority was not being relinquished, but as an employee, a hand. He told Victor he needed work and had nowhere else to go, which was nearly true, and Victor had agreed, which told Rowan everything he needed to know about how confident Victor was in his position. A confident man keeps his enemies close because he enjoys it. An uncertain man doesn't let them through the gate. He thought he'd won, Rowan said. He let me stay because having me here, working for him, on land my father built. I think that pleased him. Adeline looked at him. And you stayed because from the inside you could see everything. From the inside I could see everything, he agreed. But seeing it and proving it are not the same problem, and I spent 3 years learning the difference. The management agreement, the forged one, was the keystone. Everything else Victor had done was built on its foundation. The land transfers had been executed under his operational authority. The parallel payroll account had been set up using the management agreement as authorization. Even the LLC structures held up legally only because Victor had document authority over the ranch's operations. Destroy the agreement, and everything built on top of it collapsed. The notary, Adeline said, on the management agreement. Who was it? A woman named Patricia Deese. She had an office in Billings, retired 2 years ago. Did she actually notarize it? She notarized something. Whether she knew what she was notarizing. He paused. I don't know. I've never been able to speak to her directly. Where is she now? Moved to Whitefish. Has a daughter there. Adeline wrote the name in her head because she had stopped writing names in the notebook 2 days ago and was keeping everything in the organized filing system she'd built in her memory, which was less secure than paper, but considerably harder for Victor to find in her suitcase. I can find her. You'd need to be careful about how you approached her. I know how to talk to someone who might be scared, Adeline said, and she said it the way you say something that comes from experience rather than confidence, which is a different thing entirely. Rowan looked at her with something she couldn't immediately categorize. Then he said, My attorney in Billings. I've stayed in contact. He hasn't had anything actionable to work with, but if you can get the notary on record, I need the handwriting analysis too, the signature comparison. I have one. Informal. Done by a retired forensic documents examiner I found through an academic contact. She reviewed samples and put her conclusion in writing. He paused. She said she'd testify. Adeline stopped. You have an expert who'll testify, and you haven't. I have an expert who'll testify to the signature comparison, he said. What I don't have is a way to present it in a proceeding that can't be dismissed because it's just a disgruntled son trying to overturn his father's valid agreement. I need corroboration. I need the fraud around the agreement to be documented independently. He looked at her steadily. I need books that prove Victor has been stealing, which proves he had a motive to forge the agreement in the first place. She understood then. The complete picture. Why he had put the documents in the fence post. Why he had pointed her toward the county records. Why he had rationed information carefully, but always given her the next thing she needed precisely when she needed it. He hadn't been leading her. He'd been building with her. Each piece she found independently corroborated a piece of the larger case he'd been assembling for years. And her clean documentation, a credentialed bookkeeper with no prior relationship to the ranch and no stake in the outcome, was worth more evidentiary weight than anything he could produce himself. She was the independent witness he'd been waiting for. You hired me, she said slowly. Not Victor. A pause that confirmed it before he spoke. The placement service that sent your file. I have a contact there. When your application came through, your background, your credentials, what happened to you with the Paulson case?" He stopped. "I asked for your file specifically." The information arrived like something falling from a height, and she stood under it and let it land. He had known about Daniel, about Gregor Paulson, about the investment fraud and the savings and the kitchen table with the papers spread out on it. He had known her story, and he had chosen her because of it, because a woman who had already been destroyed by financial fraud was, perhaps, the most motivated possible person to walk into a room full of it and not look away. She should have been angry. She tested for it, the way you test ice with one foot before committing your weight. She wasn't angry. She was something more complicated than angry, something that had anger in it, and also recognition, and also the strange, uncomfortable feeling of being understood by someone who had never explained themselves to her, which is not entirely unlike being read without permission. "You could have told me all of this on day one," she said. "On day one, you might have left." "You don't know that." "No," he admitted. "But I couldn't take the chance. And I needed your work to be real, genuinely independent. If you'd known the owner sent you in, Victor's lawyers would argue the whole investigation was orchestrated." He paused. "They may argue it anyway." "They'll have trouble arguing with the county land records," she said. "Those are public documents I pulled on my own initiative." "Yes." "And the fuel gauge readings, and the payroll cross-referencing, and the signature analysis I started independently based on documents already in the office system." She was thinking out loud, pacing the sequence the way she paced a balance sheet, looking for the load-bearing elements. "The fence post documents are more complicated. A judge could argue you planted those." "I know, so they can't be our primary evidence. They need to corroborate, not lead." "Agreed." She looked at him. "You've thought about all of this." "For 3 years," he said, and it came out so tired she almost felt it physically. The accumulated weight of 3 years of patience and calculation and sleeping in a bunkhouse on land his father built, taking orders from the man who stole it. "Okay," she said, "here's what we need. The notary. I'll find her and talk to her, and whatever she says gets documented properly with your attorney present. The handwriting expert goes on record formally, not informally. We file for a formal handwriting analysis through the court, which means Victor's lawyers can't claim we fabricated ours. And I need 2 more weeks in that office." She met his eyes. "Can you give me 2 more weeks? Victor is already moving to restrict your access." "I know. Then I need to move faster than he does." She straightened. "And I need you to let me inside the main house filing room, the one he keeps locked." Silence. "I know there's a locked room," she said. "I've seen him come out of it twice. There's no key on the main ring." "How do you know I have access?" She waited. "I built this house," he said quietly. "My father built it. I know where every key is." The locked room had not been a file room originally. It had been his father's study. She could see that in the built-in bookshelves that lined 2 walls, and the desk that was older than anything else in the building, a heavy oak thing that had survived several decades and would survive several more. Victor had converted it into storage for the documents he wanted inaccessible. The original contracts with the suppliers he'd been defrauding, printed copies of the LLC registrations, a spiral-bound ledger that appeared to be his personal record of the diversion scheme. The personal ledger was unexpected and significant. Fraudsters who kept their own records of their fraud were not uncommon, she knew. The psychological need to account for what you'd taken was real, even if it was self-incriminating. But Victor's ledger was more than that. It had dates, amounts, and next to certain entries, initials that corresponded, she was fairly confident, to the individuals who had received payments in exchange for cooperation. BR appearing twice next to the land transfers. A set of initials she didn't recognize, PM, appearing next to a series of payments that predated her arrival by 2 years. She photographed every page. Her hands were steady, which she noted out of habit. Rowan stood at the door, not watching her work, watching the yard. He had the quality of stillness that came from years of learning to look like he was doing nothing when he was, in fact, doing everything. She finished, and they left the room exactly as they'd found it, and Rowan locked it behind them, and they walked in different directions across the dark yard, because that was the operational logic they'd established without discussing it, because they were both, it turned out, the kind of people who understood how to move carefully inside a hostile environment. So, she called Patricia Deese from her cell phone on a Tuesday afternoon, parked in the lot of the gas station in Bitter Creek. because it was the one place in a 40-minute radius where her presence had an obvious innocent explanation. She had found the number through a property tax record, which was public, which was the only kind of database she was using because she understood chain of evidence. The phone rang 4 times. Then a woman's voice, cautious, older. "Hello? Mrs. Deese, my name is Adeline Mercer. I'm a bookkeeper. I'm not with any law enforcement agency, and I'm not calling to threaten you. I'm calling because I need to ask you about a notarization you may have performed approximately 5 years ago for a document relating to Iron Creek Ranch in Bitter Creek County." Silence. Long enough that Adeline thought the call had dropped. "How did you get this number?" Patricia Deese said. "Property tax record. It's public." Another silence. Then, quietly, "I wondered when someone would call." Adeline sat very still in the parking lot. A pickup truck pulled in beside her, and a man got out and went inside for cigarettes and came back out and left. And the whole time she sat there with the phone to her ear and her heart doing something that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite hope. "Can we meet?" she said. "What?" Patricia Deese was 73 years old and had the manner of someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had made her peace with the weight but not with the carrying. She met Adeline at a diner in Whitefish, 3 hours from Bitter Creek, which Adeline drove on her day off, telling nobody where she was going, and she ordered coffee and looked out the window for a long moment before she spoke. "I notarized what he brought me," she said. "That's the truth. A man came to my office with a document and an identification, and I followed my procedure." She paused. "But the signature on the document, I had notarized things for Robert Hale before. Several times over the years. Land documents, business filings." She looked at her coffee. "The signature on that management agreement did not look like Robert Hale's signature." "You said something at the time?" "I asked the man if Mr. Hale was present to sign in person." She curled both hands around her coffee mug. "He said Mr. Hale had signed it at the care facility and that I was to notarize his acknowledgement of the prior signature. He showed me a letter from Mr. Hale's doctor saying Mr. Hale was competent but too ill to travel." She paused. "The letter looked real. I was not an expert. I followed what the procedure allowed." A long beat. "I have thought about it many times since." "Would you be willing to provide a statement?" Adeline said. "To an attorney. On the record." Patricia Deese looked at her for a while. She had the eyes of someone who had lived long enough to know that doing the right thing late is not the same as doing it right, but is sometimes the only option remaining. "Yes," she said. "I'll give a statement." On the 3-hour drive back, Adeline kept both hands on the wheel and watched the mountains and let herself feel, for approximately 40 miles, the specific sensation of something enormous beginning to shift. Not victory. She was too experienced with the distance between evidence and outcome to call it victory. But movement. The grinding, heavy, initial movement of something that had been stuck for a very long time. Rowan's attorney was a woman named Claire Ogilvy, based in Billings, who had been practicing law for 26 years and had the manner of someone who had heard every variety of human wrongdoing and found it neither surprising nor acceptable, which Adeline thought was exactly the right disposition for what was ahead. Claire came to Bitter Creek on a Friday, quietly, driving her own car and registering at a motel in the next town over, because Victor had eyes in Bitter Creek, and they all knew it. They met at Rowan's truck, parked at a trailhead 8 miles from the ranch, on a cold afternoon that kept other people away. Adeline laid out her documentation on the truck's tailgate, organized in the sequence she'd built over 3 weeks, and walked Claire Ogilvy through it with the precision she'd used for 11 years when explaining complex accounts to people who needed to understand exactly where every dollar had gone. Claire asked good questions. She asked them without inflection, which Adeline appreciated. Not skeptical, not credulous, just surgical. "The personal ledger," Claire said. "You accessed the locked room." "Yes," Adeline said, "with a key that Rowan provided." "Yes." Claire looked at Rowan. "You're the legal owner of that room." "I'm the legal owner of everything on that property," Rowan said. "That's the argument we'll make," Claire said. "It's defensible, but we need to be prepared for a challenge." She looked back at Adeline's documents. "Everything else was accessed through normal job duties or public records?" "Everything else," Adeline confirmed. Claire nodded slowly, looking at the organized stacks. Then she said, "Who knows you're building this?" "Victor knows I've been pulling records." He doesn't know the extent. Adeline paused. And there's a deputy, Benjamin Rourke, co-signed one of the land transfers. Claire's expression didn't change, but something behind it sharpened. I know Ben Rourke, she said. Is that a problem? Not for us. A pause. There's a state attorney's investigator I've worked with. She has no relationship with the county sheriff's office. If we bring this to her directly, we go above Rourke entirely. How quickly can you reach her? Rowan said. I can make a call tonight. Claire began gathering the documents with the systematic care of someone who understood what they represented. I want copies of everything. Originals stay with Mrs. Mercer until we have a formal filing strategy. Victor is going to move to restrict my office access, Adeline said, possibly this week. Then we move this week, Claire said. It was not a dramatic statement. It was a scheduling decision delivered in the flat, practical tone of someone who had converted urgency into logistics many times before. Rowan was quiet on the drive back, not the rationed, strategic quiet of the past weeks, but something different. The quiet of a person sitting with a reality that had been theoretical for years and was suddenly becoming concrete in ways both necessary and frightening. She understood that. The move from fighting in private to fighting in public was not a small one. Once Claire Ogilvy made her call, the machinery would begin, and machinery could not be unstarted. You sure? She said, somewhere on the county road back to the ranch. He drove for a moment. If I'm sure I want my own ranch back. I'm asking if you're prepared for what comes between now and then. He was quiet again. Then, I've been sleeping in the bunkhouse for 3 years, Mrs. Mercer. I am past prepared. Oh. The trap, as they designed it, was elegant in the way practical things are elegant, not because anyone tried to make it beautiful, but because it fit the situation exactly. No unnecessary parts. Victor believed he controlled the information flow. He believed Denny was reporting accurately, which Denny was. Denny reported that the bookkeeper was methodical and slightly tedious and had not done anything alarming since the county records incident. What Denny didn't know to report was the content of the truck bed meetings at the trailhead, or the 3-hour drive to Whitefish, or the calls from Adeline's personal data plan to a number in Billings. Victor believed Rowan was a loyal, if not particularly engaged employee. 8 years of compliance will do that. After long enough, a person stops being a variable and becomes furniture. Victor saw Rowan and processed him as part of the landscape. What Victor did not know was that Claire Ogilvy had spoken to the state attorney's investigator, a woman named Sandra Pruitt, who had looked at the preliminary documentation and used the word substantial in a way that Claire later told Adeline meant she was already thinking about charges. What Victor did not know was that Patricia Deese had provided a sworn statement, witnessed and notarized by a Whitefish notary who had no connection to anyone involved, describing in careful detail every doubt she'd had about the signature on the Iron Creek Management Agreement. What Victor did not know was that the retired forensic documents examiner, Dr. Margaret Cho, had now submitted her formal analysis through the court-adjacent process Claire had arranged, comparing the signature on the management agreement to 14 verified exemplars of Robert Hale's signature from the decade preceding his death, and had concluded in writing with a confidence level she was prepared to defend under cross-examination. What Victor believed was that he had one more card to play, and he played it on a Wednesday, which was the most forgettable day of the week. He came to Adeline's office at 10 in the morning with a manila envelope and the pleasant expression, and he set the envelope on her desk and said, I'm going to have to let you go, Adeline. 2 weeks' notice, severance as discussed in your contract. She looked at the envelope, then at him. On what grounds? Restructuring. We're moving accounting to an outside firm. That's your right, she said. She picked up the envelope. She opened it. She read the termination notice with the same attention she gave every document, which meant she read it twice. This is dated yesterday. Standard practice. She set it down. I'll need to complete the month-end reconciliation before I go. Professional obligation. It would leave the incoming firm in a difficult position otherwise. His pleasant expression wanted to slip. He held it. That won't be necessary. I'd feel better completing it, she said. 2 more days. It's the right thing for the ranch. He looked at her with the leash expression again. 1 day, he said. Of course, she said. He left, and she did not watch him go, because she didn't need to. She already knew everything she needed to know about where Victor Langford was standing. She picked up her phone and sent a text to a number Claire had given her, which was Sandra Pruitt's direct line. Using the words they'd agreed on, clock started. One day. Then she opened the month-end reconciliation file and began working, because she had one day left in this office, and she intended to fill every hour of it with the most thorough, most meticulous, most extensively documented accounting work of her entire 11-year career. Her hands were not shaking. Outside the window, Rowan Hale walked past without looking in, and the space between them had the quality of two people who had decided something together, and the decision was already in motion, and there was nothing left now but to let it go where it was going. The cattle moved in the south field. The hawk had come back, or a different hawk, she couldn't tell from here, and it was riding the same thermal as before, patient and unhurried, waiting for exactly the right moment to stop circling and commit. Sandra Pruitt arrived in Bitter Creek the same way good investigators always arrive somewhere, unremarkably. A plain sedan, state plates but not obviously official, parked outside the hardware store at 8:15 in the morning, like she'd stopped for something mundane. She was 55, compact, with short gray hair, and the kind of face that didn't give you anything until she decided to give it to you. She had worked financial crimes for the state attorney's office for 19 years, and she carried herself with the particular economy of someone who had long ago stopped needing to prove anything to anyone. Claire had arranged the meeting at a property 12 miles from Iron Creek, a vacant farmhouse belonging to a retired couple who wintered in Arizona and had given Claire a spare key 2 years ago for reasons unrelated to any of this. It smelled like dust and closed-up winter and the particular sadness of a house waiting for people who weren't there, and none of the three women sitting at the kitchen table paid it any attention because they were focused on the documents spread across its surface. Adeline had spent her final day in the Iron Creek office doing exactly what she'd told Victor she would do, completing the month-end reconciliation. Every number clean, every entry sourced and verified. She had printed the reconciliation report on the grinding old printer at 4:50 in the afternoon, signed it, dated it, left it on the desk for the incoming accounting firm that Victor had certainly not yet hired. And in the hour before that, she had accessed every file in the office system that she had legitimate reason to access as the departing bookkeeper, and had forwarded the complete records to an encrypted file-sharing account Claire had established, using the ranch's own internet connection, because she was still an employee until the end of that day, and the records were part of her professional responsibility to document. Victor had told her she had until end of business. She had worked until end of business. She had left the key on the desk beside the reconciliation report, driven the ranch truck to the main house, handed Denny the keys with a pleasant and unrevealing smile, collected her suitcase from the guest house, loaded it into the car she'd borrowed from Claire, and driven away from Iron Creek Ranch in the Montana dark, without looking back. Because looking back was a luxury, and she had never been able to afford luxuries. Now she sat across from Sandra Pruitt and walked her through the case with the same precision she'd used with Claire, and Sandra Pruitt asked even better questions, the kind that identified exactly which elements would carry the most weight in a formal proceeding and which would need additional corroboration. The personal ledger, Sandra said, the one in the locked room. Photographed, every page. Admissibility will be contested. I know, but the ledger confirms the initials BR, which corroborates the land transfer records from the county office, which are independent public documents. The ledger doesn't lead the case. It confirms it. Sandra looked at her for a moment. You've thought about evidentiary structure. I've thought about very little else for 3 weeks. A small pause. The former notary's statement, Patricia Deese. Sworn witnessed filed with Claire's office yesterday morning. And the handwriting analysis. Dr. Margaret Cho, retired forensic documents examiner, 22 years with the state crime lab before that. Formal report filed through the process Claire arranged. She's prepared to testify. Sandra Pruitt sat back and looked at the table full of documents. She had the quality of stillness that Adeline had come to associate with people who were genuinely competent. Not the performed stillness of someone managing an impression, but the real kind that comes from not needing to fill silence with noise. Deputy Rourke, Sandra said. Co-signed the second land transfer, Adeline said. The 52-acre northwest parcel. I'm aware of Deputy Rourke, Sandra said, in a tone that contained a file's worth of information delivered in 6 words. He won't be a problem. Adeline didn't ask how. There were things she needed to know and things she didn't need to know. and the operational disposition of a corrupt sheriff's deputy was in the second category. Claire had told her to trust Sandra's process above the county level, and Claire had been right about everything so far. "What's the timeline like?" Rowan said. He was standing near the door, not at the table. He had a way of positioning himself at the edges of rooms that she was beginning to understand had less to do with personality and more to do with years of practicing invisibility in a place where being seen too clearly was dangerous. "I can have a filing ready within 72 hours, Sandra said. "Fraud, forgery, breach of fiduciary duty, conspiracy. The land transfers give us a basis for asset recovery proceedings to run parallel." She looked at Rowan directly. "The management agreement will be challenged in civil court concurrently with the criminal filing. Given what we have from Dr. Cho and Mrs. Deese, I expect the civil challenge to succeed, but I want you prepared for the fact that legal proceedings are not fast." "I've been waiting 5 years, Rowan said. "I can wait for the law." Well, they chose a Thursday morning for the meeting at Iron Creek Ranch. Mornings because Victor was more controlled in the evenings. He drank, not heavily but reliably, and a man who drank reliably was more unpredictable after noon. Thursday because it was ordinary, not a Monday, which might put him on guard, and not a Friday, when people were already halfway somewhere else. Victor received a call from Claire Ogilvy's office on Wednesday afternoon informing him that there was a legal matter requiring his immediate attention regarding the Iron Creek Ranch management agreement and requesting his presence at the ranch's main meeting room at 9 the following morning. The call came from a paralegal, not Claire herself, in a tone that was professionally neutral and gave him no specific information about the nature of the matter, only that his presence was required and that his own legal representation was welcome. He called his attorney in Billings, a man named Gerald Fitch, who had been handling Victor's affairs for 7 years and who arrived at Iron Creek by 8:15 Thursday morning in a car that cost more than most ranch hands made in a year. Gerald Fitch was the kind of attorney who wore his confidence like a garment, expansive and well-tailored, and he shook Victor's hand in the driveway and said something that made Victor's shoulders drop slightly in relief. They both went inside believing this was manageable. That was the thing Adeline had understood about men like Victor. They believed in their own architecture until the moment it fell. Adeline arrived with Claire at 8:50. Sandra Pruitt was already there, had been there since 8, having arranged with Rowan to come early, along with 2 state investigators whose presence in the main meeting room was not announced to Victor in advance, and was, from a legal standpoint, entirely appropriate given the nature of the filing that Sandra had submitted the previous afternoon. The third person Adeline had not expected was Curtis. He was sitting in a chair near the window when she came in, the older hand with the sun-weathered face and the missing fingertip, the man who had started to raise his hand in Victor's office on her first day and then put it back down. He was dressed in clothes that suggested he understood this was not an ordinary morning, and he was holding a manila folder in both hands with the careful attention of someone transporting something fragile. She looked at him. He looked at her. He nodded once, a small movement that acknowledged something between them that had never been spoken. "He's a witness," Claire said quietly, beside her. Rowan found him. Curtis Alderman. He was there when the management agreement was presented to the ranch's primary accounts holder at the regional bank. Victor told the bank officer that Robert Hale had authorized the agreement personally. Curtis was in the lobby. He heard it. Adeline looked at the manila folder in Curtis's hands. "What's in that?" "His own notes," Claire said. He kept notes. Dates, things he overheard, payroll discrepancies he noticed. He's not a trained bookkeeper, so the notes are rough, but they go back 4 years. 4 years of a ranch hand writing things down in private because something felt wrong and he couldn't prove it and couldn't afford to lose his job but couldn't quite bring himself to let it go. She thought about her notebook, the granola bars, the broken suitcase wheel that made a sound on pavement like punctuation. "Is he protected?" she said. "Legally, if Victor retaliates, he's covered under the whistleblower provisions in the filing Sandra submitted yesterday," Claire said, "as of 4 o'clock yesterday afternoon." Adeline looked at Curtis again. He was still holding the folder with both hands. He met her eyes and she saw in his face what she recognized because she had lived in it. The specific exhaustion of someone who has been carrying a private knowledge for too long and is finally, at considerable cost, setting it down. Victor came in at 9:03 with Gerald Fitch at his shoulder, and he stopped when he saw the room, And Adeline watched his face run through a sequence that lasted about 4 seconds. Surprise, reassessment, the rapid construction of a new position, and then the performance of that position, which was controlled authority. He looked at Sandra Pruitt's credentials on the table. He looked at the two investigators. He looked at Curtis. He looked at Rowan, who was standing at the far end of the room in the same posture he used everywhere, relaxed, present, giving nothing away. He did not look at Adeline immediately, and when he did, it was brief and recalculating, like a man reassessing the weight of something he'd assumed was light. "Victor," Claire said, "please sit down." Gerald Fitch said, "Before anyone says anything, I want the purpose of this meeting clearly stated on the record." "Absolutely," Sandra Pruitt said, and opened the folder in front of her. "My name is Sandra Pruitt, State Attorney's investigator. As of 4 o'clock yesterday afternoon, I filed formal charges with the State Attorney's Office on behalf of the state, including fraud, forgery of a legal instrument, breach of fiduciary duty, conspiracy, and theft exceeding $500,000. A concurrent civil action for property recovery has been filed on behalf of Mr. Rowan James Hale, the legal owner of Iron Creek Ranch." She looked at Victor with an expression that was neither hostile nor sympathetic, just accurate. "You were notified this morning as a courtesy prior to formal service. Service will occur at the conclusion of this meeting." Gerald Fitch's practiced confidence developed a hairline crack. He leaned to Victor and said something in a low voice. Victor's jaw was set. I was not looking at Sandra anymore. He was looking at Rowan. "You've been here 8 years, he said. His voice was controlled, but there was something under it now, something she hadn't heard from him before. Not quite fear, more like the vertigo of a man realizing the ground he thought he was standing on was made of something entirely different. 8 years working on this ranch, and this is my ranch, Rowan said, simply, without performance. Victor turned to Gerald Fitch. "This is a challenge to the management agreement. We've been over this. The agreement is legally valid. It was properly executed." "Mr. Langford," Claire said, "I'd like to introduce some documentation." She slid a packet across the table. Gerald Fitch reached for it, read the first page, and his expression did something that was not quite visible but was felt in the room like a change in air pressure. "That is the formal handwriting analysis conducted by Dr. Margaret Cho, submitted through the state court's expert process, comparing the signature on your management agreement to 14 verified exemplars of Robert Hale's signature. Dr. Cho's conclusion is that the signature on the management agreement was not produced by Robert Hale." Victor said nothing. "Additionally," Claire continued, "we have a sworn statement from Patricia Deese, the notary who processed the agreement, in which she describes her doubts about the signature at the time of notarization and the circumstances under which she was presented with the document." Another packet across the table. "And we have documentation from your own records, accessed through the Iron Creek office system as part of Mrs. Mercer's professional duties, establishing a comprehensive pattern of payroll fraud, unauthorized land transfers, and diversion of funds spanning 5 years. Gerald Fitch was reading. The quality of his reading had changed. It was no longer the skim of a man looking for weaknesses in someone else's argument. It was the careful, slowing read of someone encountering things he had not been told, and that changed the shape of everything he thought he knew. Victor looked at Adeline for the first time since the brief recalculating glance when he'd entered the room. He looked at her with something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite respect, something in between that had no clean name. "You were here less than a month," he said. 23 days, she said. "And in 23 days you—" "I did my job," she said. It came out even and factual, which was exactly how she intended it. "You hired a bookkeeper. I kept books." Something worked in his face. "I didn't hire you," he said slowly, and he turned to look at Rowan again. And the understanding moved across his expression like weather moving across a field, visible, inevitable, altering everything it passed over. Rowan said nothing. "You sent her in," Victor said. "She found everything independently," Rowan said. "Every document she pulled through legitimate access. The county records are public. The office system was her professional responsibility. Her methods are clean." Victor sat back in his chair. He seemed to be reorganizing something internally, reassessing the architecture of the past 3 weeks from the new position of understanding what had actually been happening. And Adeline watched it and felt not triumph. She had expected to feel something like triumph and found she didn't. found instead a kind of flat, clear recognition, the same feeling she got when a set of books finally balanced after weeks of searching for the discrepancy. Not joy, exactly, more like the relief of things being accurate. Gerald Fitch set down his reading and looked at Victor with the expression of an attorney who has just discovered that the client he came in to defend has a more complicated relationship with the truth than he was led to believe. He leaned in again, low voice, and Victor's jaw tightened and he shook his head once, small, the gesture of a man refusing a suggestion he doesn't want to hear. "I want to speak," Victor said. "Victor," Gerald Fitch started. "I want to speak." He said it with the remnants of his authority, which was the only currency he had left, and they both knew it was nearly spent. He looked around the table, at Claire, at Sandra, at Curtis, whose presence seemed to cost him something. Curtis, who had been in that lobby, who had been in that office on Adeline's first day, who had started to raise his hand and put it back down, and then apparently had spent 4 years writing things in a notebook because he couldn't live with complete silence. "You have no idea," Victor said, "what it takes to run an operation like this. What I did, what I built here. The ranch was bleeding money when Robert Hale brought me in. The cattle contracts were failing, the hay revenues were half what they should have been. I stabilized this operation. I made it viable." "You stole from the people who worked it," Adeline said. He looked at her. "Not from some abstract entity," she said. "From Curtis. From every man on this ranch whose paycheck you shorted. From the family whose land you transferred to companies you owned under different names." She was not raising her voice. She had found, over the past 3 weeks, that she had no interest in raising her voice at Victor Langford. Raised voices were for people who needed to convince others they were right. She had documents. "I know exactly how much you took from each of them, to the dollar. I've had weeks to calculate it." The room was quiet. "How much?" Curtis said from his chair near the window. It was the first time he'd spoken, and his voice had the quality of a man who has been waiting a long time to ask a question. "How much did he take from us?" Adeline looked at him. "From the workers on this ranch, across 4 years of payroll fraud, a total of $214,000. Spread across 12 to 16 employees depending on the year, an average of $4,100 per person per year." Curtis absorbed that. He pressed his lips together. He looked at the folder in his hands, and Adeline thought about what $4,100 a year meant to a man who made $35,000 and had a family and a truck that needed new tires and a body that was getting older in a profession that didn't get easier with age. "Thank you," Curtis said quietly, and she understood that he wasn't thanking her for the number. "I was thanking her for saying it out loud, in a room with people who had the authority to do something about it, because the theft of that money had happened in silence, and the silence had been its own ongoing injury, and now at least it was spoken." Victor had stopped speaking. Gerald Fitch made one more attempt. He was professional enough and competent enough to try, because that was what he was paid for. He raised procedural questions about evidence access, about the chain of custody for the documents from the locked room, about the standing of an informal notary observation. Sandra Pruitt answered each question with the patience of someone who had anticipated every one of them, because she had, and Claire reinforced each answer with the specific case law, and Adeline sat across the table and watched it happen and said nothing, because there was nothing left that required her to say it. The architecture collapsed in pieces, not all at once. That was what she hadn't anticipated. Not a dramatic implosion, but a methodical, piece-by-piece dismantling, each objection met and answered and set aside, each alternative narrative tried and found insufficient against the weight of what she had spent 3 weeks documenting. Victor's attempts to reframe the land transfers as legitimate business arrangements ran into the timeline of the LLC registrations, 4 days, in one case, before the transfer. His suggestion that the payroll discrepancies were accounting errors ran into the parallel account documentation and the ghost employee names. His characterization of the management agreement as a valid contract ran into Dr. Cho's analysis and Patricia Deese's statement, and the fact that no one had ever been able to produce a single piece of evidence that Robert Hale had understood what he was signing. At 10:47 in the morning, Gerald Fitch asked for a recess and took Victor into the hallway. They were out there for 11 minutes. When they came back, Gerald Fitch sat down and said 3 words that closed the chapter on Victor Langford's 5-year operation at Iron Creek Ranch. "We're not contesting. Not an admission, not an apology. Just the statement of a man on behalf of his client that the contest was over, which in its own way was more definitive than any dramatic confession would have been. Victor was looking at the table. He had the look of a man who had spent years building something and was now watching a different man sit at the head of it. Rowan had moved, at some point during the proceedings, from the end of the room to the chair at the head of the table, not dramatically, just naturally, the way a person moves into a space that belongs to them. Sandra Pruitt was precise about what came next. She described the formal service process, the appearance requirement, the asset freeze that had been applied to the LLC accounts as of the previous afternoon's filing. She described it the way she described everything, without editorial, without inflection, the plain administrative language of consequence. Victor stood when it was time to stand. He straightened his jacket, which was the last gesture available to him, and he looked at Rowan one more time. "Your father," he said, and then stopped. Whatever he'd been going to say, he didn't say it. "My father built this ranch," Rowan said, "every acre of it. And you knew that when you came here. You knew it the whole time." Victor said nothing. He walked out of the room with Gerald Fitch, and the sound of them in the hallway diminished. And then there was the sound of the front door. And then there was the quiet that comes after something has finally ended. The two investigators followed them out. Sandra Pruitt gathered her documents with methodical care. Claire was making notes. Curtis was sitting in his chair near the window with his manila folder still in both hands, and his eyes doing something complicated that he was managing with the dignity of a man who had learned to feel things without performing them. Rowan was looking at the table, not at anyone. At the surface of it, which was the same table his father had used for ranch business for 30 years. Adeline had nothing left to do. All the documents were filed. All the numbers were verified. The case she had built in 23 days was now in the hands of people with the authority and the structure to carry it to its conclusion. She had done the thing she came to do, which was find every dollar and account for everyone and put the evidence somewhere it couldn't be unmade. She should have felt emptied out. She had felt emptied out after other completions, the big reconciliations, the audits that took months, the moment when a balance sheet finally resolved after weeks of searching. That hollow, mission-accomplished quiet. But she didn't feel empty. She felt like someone standing at the end of a long road who had just looked back and realized the road was longer than she'd understood while she was walking it. She was aware of Rowan beside her, not looking at her, sitting with his hands flat on the table, in the chair that was his, in the room that was his, in the house his father had built. "The workers," she said quietly, "the wages that were taken, the asset recovery proceeding. First priority," Claire said, without looking up from her notes. Sandra flagged it in the filing. "The frozen accounts have enough to cover full restitution for every employee affected, based on Mrs. Mercer's calculations." She glanced up. "With interest, actually. The LLC accounts have been accruing." Curtis made a sound. It was not words. It was the sound a person makes when something they'd stopped expecting turns out to be real. Adeline looked at him. He was looking at the window now, at the yard outside, at the land under the Montana sky that belonged to Rowan Hale and that 14 men like Curtis had worked for years under a system designed to take from them quietly and call it employment. "Curtis," she said. He looked at her. "You kept notes for 4 years," she said, "when nobody asked you to, when you could have—" She paused. "It mattered. What you recorded. It corroborates the timeline in a way that pure financial records can't." He looked at his hands on the folder. "I didn't know if it would ever be any use," he said. "I just couldn't not write it down." She understood that completely. The inability to not record a wrong, even when you couldn't see how the record would ever help. She had lived in that too, for 11 years, ledger by ledger, and it was not heroism. It was just a particular refusal to pretend the numbers said something they didn't. "It was use," she said. He nodded. One small, definitive movement. Outside, through the window, she could see the yard, the equipment barn, the south field, the fence line that ran toward the northeast corner, where a metal box in a hollow post had started all of this, put there by a man who had been waiting years for someone to find it and know what to do. The Hawks were there again, or still, or always, she had lost track, riding the thermal above the south boundary over the 14 acres that belonged to a Delaware LLC that would shortly belong to no one who had any right to it. The room had the quality of aftermath. Not quiet exactly, more like the specific texture of a space where something significant has just finished, the air still holding the shape of it. Adeline picked up her coat from the back of her chair. She had the suitcase in Claire's car, the same worn leather bag with the broken wheel she'd dragged rather than rolled when she arrived. $63 had become considerably less in 3 weeks of gas station granola bars and 1 3-hour drive to Whitefish, and she still didn't have a job, and she still didn't have a plan that extended beyond this morning. But the books balanced. Everything she'd found was accounted for, every number verified, every theft documented and submitted to people with the power to make it mean something. She picked up her coat and began to put it on. And Rowan Hale, who owned 420 acres of Montana and a house his father built and a cattle operation that had been stolen from him for 5 years, and was now, at least in the ways that could be filed and documented and processed through proper channels, beginning to come back. Rowan Hale looked up from the table and said, "Where are you going?" She looked at him. "I don't work here anymore," she said. "Victor terminated my contract yesterday." He looked at her steadily. "Victor didn't have the authority to hire you. He didn't have the authority to terminate you either." She held his gaze. Outside, a cloud moved across the morning sun, and the light in the room shifted, and the yard outside went briefly into shadow and then back into light. "I don't actually have anywhere to be," she said, which was honest, and which cost her something to say out loud, and which she said anyway because 23 days on this ranch had stripped away most of her remaining capacity for pretending. "Then stay," he said. "There are books that need keeping." She stood with her coat half on and looked at him, and she thought about $63 and a broken suitcase wheel and a placement service that had sent her file to a man who already knew her story. She thought about a fence post box and a handwritten note and a set of numbers that had told the truth when everything around them was built to obscure it. She thought about Daniel at the kitchen table and what it would have meant to him to know that the woman he'd loved had walked into a room full of fraud and come out the other side with the books clean. "The wages first," she said, "making sure every worker receives exactly what was taken from them. That gets done before anything else." "Agreed," Rowan said. She finished putting on her coat. Then she sat back down. The restitution checks went out on a Friday, which was not planned to be symbolic but turned out to be anyway, because Friday was payday at Iron Creek Ranch and had been for 30 years, going back to when Robert Hale had established the practice of paying his workers at the end of the week so they'd have the weekend to handle whatever needed handling. Victor had kept the Friday schedule because changing it would have raised questions, and now the Friday schedule continued for a different reason entirely, carrying a different weight. Adeline had prepared the calculations over the preceding 2 weeks, with the same methodology she'd applied to everything else. Start with the verified records, work outward, confirm every number twice before committing it to paper. The amounts varied by employee and by year, because Victor had not stolen uniformly. He'd taken more from the workers who were least likely to notice or least positioned to object, which was its own particular cruelty, the way predators of that kind always find the specific angle of least resistance. Some men were owed $1,100. Curtis Alderman was owed $6,240 across 4 years, which was the largest individual amount, and which Adeline had verified 3 times because she wanted to be certain before she put it in front of him. She had driven to the bank in Bitter Creek with Rowan on the Thursday before the checks went out, and the branch manager, a different person than whoever had processed Victor's parallel account years earlier, the bank having cycled through staff in the intervening time, had processed the withdrawals from the unfrozen operational account with the manner of someone who understood the significance of what they were doing and chose to treat it as routine, which was exactly the right call. The checks were plain, no ceremony to the paper itself, no special envelope, just the amounts, the dates, the names. Adeline had addressed each one by hand because she thought that mattered, though she would have had difficulty explaining exactly why, only that these were people's names and their money, and they deserved to have someone write their name down deliberately rather than have it printed by a machine. Curtis was first, not because of the amount, but because he had been there longest. He came into the main house at Rowan's request on Friday morning, still in his work jacket, hat in hand, and Rowan handed him the envelope and said, "This is what was taken from you, with interest, like Claire said. The calculations are Mrs. Mercer's." Curtis opened the envelope. He looked at the check for a long moment. His face did something that he controlled with the practiced restraint of a man who had spent his life around other men and had learned to feel things privately. 6,000, he said. $6,240, Adeline said. The 40 matters. He looked up at her. Yes, he said. It does. He folded the check once, carefully, and put it in his shirt pocket and buttoned the pocket. I need to call my daughter, he said. She's been after me to fix the truck. The rear axle. He stopped, pressed his lips together. It's been 6 months since I could afford to fix it. He stopped again. Nobody filled the silence, which was the right thing to do. Thank you, he said, and walked back out into the yard. The other checks went out through the afternoon. Some men took them without much visible reaction, the way people receive things they've needed a long time, quietly, with a kind of careful gratitude that doesn't want to be looked at directly. 2 men cried briefly, and both of them seemed more embarrassed by the crying than by anything else, and Adeline looked away both times because she understood that sometimes the most respectful thing you can do for someone's dignity is to not witness the exact moment it cracks. One man, young, maybe 24, held his check and looked at Rowan and said, I didn't even know it was happening. I didn't know what I should have been getting paid. You know now, Rowan said, and the rate going forward is in your contract, the real contract. You can read it before you sign it and ask any question you want. The young man nodded. He folded the check the same way Curtis had, in the same shirt pocket position, which was not a coincidence. Curtis had walked back through the yard after his conversation in the main house and had spoken to several of the hands. And the word had moved through the group in the organic way information moves through communities of people who work together and eat together and have been collectively wronged together without fully knowing it. By 3 o'clock Friday afternoon, Iron Creek Ranch had paid back every dollar it owed its workers. Adeline sat at the desk in the main house office, not the converted study with the locked filing room, but the operational office where she'd spent 3 weeks grinding through records on an outdated computer, and ran the final reconciliation and confirmed the balance and wrote the date on the top of the page and signed her name below it. The books balanced. They balanced completely, in every column, with every entry sourced and verified and accounted for. She sat with that for a moment, the way she always sat with a balanced set of books, which was not with triumph but with something quieter, the satisfaction of accuracy, of things being what they actually were, rather than what someone had arranged them to appear to be. The civil proceedings moved at the speed civil proceedings move, which is to say slowly and with considerable paperwork, but they moved. Claire had been right that the management agreement challenge would succeed, and it did, though not without 3 months of procedural maneuvering from Gerald Fitch, who earned whatever Victor was paying him by making every possible argument available to him and making each one as forcefully as the evidence would allow. Dr. Cho testified in a deposition that lasted 6 hours. Patricia Deese gave her testimony in a conference room in Whitefish, and Adeline was told that Patricia had been calm and precise and had not wavered once, which did not surprise her. The agreement was voided by the court on the grounds of fraudulent execution. The specific language of the ruling used the phrase clear and convincing evidence of forgery, which Claire said was as strong a finding as they could have hoped for, and which meant the foundation of everything Victor had built collapsed with it. The criminal case moved on its own track. Sandra Pruitt's filing had been thorough enough that the state attorney's office took it without significant modification, and the charges that had been described in that meeting room on Thursday morning, fraud, forgery, conspiracy, theft exceeding $500,000, were formalized and proceeded to their own timeline. Victor entered a plea that was not guilty, which his attorney had counseled, and which everyone involved understood was a negotiating position rather than a statement of fact. The asset freeze on the LLC accounts held through the preliminary proceedings, which meant Victor's financial architecture was locked while the legal process ran its course. Deputy Benjamin Rourke was a separate matter that Sandra Pruitt handled with a competence that Adeline never fully learned the details of, only that Rourke resigned from the sheriff's office 4 weeks after the initial filing and that the land transfer he'd co-signed was included in the property recovery action. Adeline did not know what Sandra had said to him or what arrangement had been reached, and she genuinely did not need to know. Some problems had clean resolutions, and some had complicated ones, and the important thing was that they were resolved. The land came back in stages. The legal process for reversing fraudulent property transfers required each parcel to be addressed individually, which meant 4 separate proceedings for the 4 transferred parcels, and Adeline sat in on 2 of them at Claire's invitation and found the courtroom experience less dramatic than she'd expected, more like an extended accounting review than anything else. Documents presented, documents verified, findings recorded, the machinery of consequence grinding forward at its own pace. The 14-acre south parcel was the last to be formally restored, 6 months after that Thursday morning meeting. When the final order came through, Claire called Rowan directly, and Rowan came to find Adeline in the office, where she was reconciling the hay contract revenues, the real ones, based on actual deliveries and verified weights, which turned out to be considerably healthier than Victor's managed version had suggested. He stood in the doorway and said, "The south parcel came back." She looked up. "All 420 acres." "All of it." She nodded. She turned back to the spreadsheet and entered a figure, and then stopped and looked at it, and thought about a 14-acre parcel under a Montana sky, with a hawk riding a thermal overhead, not concerned with any of it. She thought about Robert Hale, who had borrowed against 40 acres and spent 12 years paying it back and built 420 acres of something that had outlasted him. She thought about a man sleeping in a bunkhouse for 3 years on land his father built, writing nothing down, trusting nothing to paper, carrying it all in the same reliable and costly internal ledger that she had used for 14 months before arriving here. "Your father would be satisfied," she said. Rowan was quiet for a moment. "That's the right word," he said. "Not happy, satisfied. He built something real. Real things survive." "Not always." "No," she agreed. "Not always. But when people fight for them, more often than you'd think." The ranch did not transform overnight into something clean and uncomplicated, because that is not how damaged things recover. 3 of the workers left in the months following, for reasons of their own that had nothing to do with anything Adeline could have changed. 1 retired, 1 took a job closer to his family. 1 simply moved on the way young men move on when the thing that kept them somewhere has resolved itself. 2 new hands were hired through a process that Rowan ran himself, in conversations at the kitchen table of the main house over coffee, with real contracts that said what they meant and wages that were what they were stated to be. The hay contracts were renegotiated with the 3 neighboring properties, and the real numbers, undistorted by Victor's revenue management, were better for all parties, which generated a cautious goodwill that hadn't existed before, because cautious goodwill requires honesty as a precondition, and honesty had not been a feature of the ranch's external relationships for 5 years. The equipment needed work. The books revealed that Victor had deferred maintenance systematically, diverting what should have been maintenance budgets into operational accounts that he then bled through the payroll fraud. Adeline built a multi-year capital recovery plan that was unglamorous and realistic and did not promise more than the numbers supported. Rowan reviewed it at the kitchen table, the same table where his father had presumably once spread out his own plans for the next season, the next year, the next decade, and made 2 corrections and asked 3 questions and approved it without ceremony. "You know," he said, setting the plan down, "I never intended for this to be your permanent situation." She looked at him across the table. They had developed, over the months since that Thursday morning, a working relationship that was efficient and occasionally comfortable and intermittently awkward in ways neither of them addressed directly, because they were both people who expressed things through work more readily than through conversation. "What did you intend?" she said. "I intended to bring you in, get the documentation, go to court, and then you'd go wherever you were going next." He picked up his coffee cup and found it empty and set it back down. "I didn't account for the possibility that I'd want you to stay." She watched him. He was looking at the empty coffee cup with the expression of a man who had said a thing and was now waiting to see what happened to it. "You could have said that more directly," she said. "I could have," he agreed. "I'm better with land than with this." "With what?" He looked up at her. "Asking for things I actually want." She thought about $63 and a broken suitcase wheel and a phone call between 7 and 8 in the morning. She thought about a notebook with a handwritten ledger and a restitched lining and a metal box and a hollow fence post. She thought about Daniel, which she did every day, but differently now. Not the shape of absence, but the shape of what he'd been, the actual person, which grief eventually gives back to you if you wait long enough. He had been a man who believed in handshakes and signed things at kitchen tables to surprise his wife. And he had been wrong about Gregor Paulson, and he had died of it. And Adeline had spent 14 months in the rubble of that, and then driven to Montana with $63 and had not looked away from a single number, no matter what it cost her. She had not been looking for anything when she came here except the next thing to survive. She was surprised to find, sitting at a kitchen table in a house that smelled like wood and coffee and the particular working land quality of a place that had been cleaned but never fussed over, that she had arrived somewhere rather than merely gotten through something. "I'm not interested in charity," she said, "or in being someone's—" She paused. "I need the work to be real, the role to be real." "The books need keeping," he said. "The ranch needs someone who understands what it actually owns and what it owes and what it's worth. That's a real job. It's not nothing." "I know it's not nothing. I've been doing it for 4 months." "Then I'm asking you to keep doing it, as a partner in the operation, not an employee." He picked up the coffee cup again, registered again that it was empty, and put it down with the mild, frustrated expression of a man betrayed by minor domestic circumstances. "Claire can draft whatever structure makes sense. I don't know what the right arrangement looks like on paper. That's your department." She looked at him. The kitchen table between them was old, scarred by decades of use. The kind of table that had absorbed the weight of 100 decisions and would absorb 100 more and not make any of them feel momentous, which was what good furniture did. "I'd want it in writing," she said. "Obviously," he said. "A real agreement, with terms that mean what they say. Mrs. Mercer." And there was something in his voice when he said it, the formal address that had started as a correction on her first day and had become, over months, something else, a private shorthand for the distance they'd started at and the distance they'd traveled. "I have spent 3 years trying to prove that a written agreement can be forged by someone without scruples. I think I'm more committed to honest contracts than most people you'll meet." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, "The coffee's cold. Make a fresh pot and we'll talk about what the terms should be." He got up to make the coffee, and she pulled the capital recovery plan back toward her and made a note in the margin about the east barn roof, which she'd been meaning to address for 2 weeks, and which the current weather would not forgive them for ignoring much longer. The note was in her handwriting, in the notebook she'd bought at the gas station in Bitter Creek 4 months ago, which she'd filled and replaced with 2 more notebooks, since all of them kept in the same orderly system of numbered pages and clear cross-referencing that had been her professional practice for 11 years. The space heater in the main house office still clicked when it ran. The printer had been replaced with one that didn't make the grinding sound, which she had arranged herself because some problems have obvious solutions and waiting for someone else to solve them is a waste of time. The east window still faced the direction that made the mornings come early, but she'd stopped resenting that. Victor Langford entered a plea agreement 7 months after the initial filing, guilty to fraud and conspiracy, the forgery charge running concurrent, the total sentence 12 years with possibility of parole consideration at 8. Gerald Fitch had negotiated competently within the available space, which was limited by the quality of Sandra Pruitt's case, which was the direct product of Adeline's 3 weeks in the Iron Creek office. The asset recovery from the LLC accounts funded the worker restitution and a portion of the civil damages, and the remainder of the civil judgment sat against Victor's personal assets, which Claire had identified and documented with the thoroughness you develop when you have worked for 26 years at the intersection of human wrongdoing and property law. Sandra Pruitt called Adeline when the plea came through. "You should know," she said, "that the quality of the financial documentation made this case significantly more straightforward than most of what I handle. The chain of evidence was clean, every number was sourced. The judge commented on it during the preliminary review." Adeline appreciated the information without knowing quite what to do with it, which was how she received most direct praise, having spent her career in the background of other people's decisions rather than at the center of her own. "I was doing my job," she said. "Yes," Sandra said. "You were. That's the point." She thought about that after the call. Doing your job. 11 years of doing her job had meant accurate books and clean reconciliations and the professional satisfaction of numbers that said the true thing. It had never meant, in those 11 years, that the job itself would become the instrument of something larger. She had not come to Iron Creek Ranch to save anything. She had come because she had $63 and the job paid $3,200 a month. The saving had been a consequence of the work, not a goal superimposed on it. She thought this was probably the honest version of most things that mattered, not grand intentions realized, but ordinary competence applied consistently to a real problem until the problem resolved. Daniel had believed in handshakes and had trusted the wrong man and had paid everything for it, and she had learned from that to trust the numbers instead. And the numbers had, in the end, told the truth about everything Victor Langford had tried to hide. There was a lesson in that. Not a comfortable one, not the kind you could frame and hang on a wall, but the kind that settled in somewhere practical and stayed. That doing your actual work, not the version of your work that looks good or sounds important, but the real granular, precise daily version of it, was the most honest form of resistance available to an ordinary person inside a system built to exploit them. That the weapons of the careful and the unglamorous are, in the end, more durable than the weapons of the bold and the corrupt. That accuracy outlasts performance every time, given enough time. She also thought, you cannot wait for someone else to start. You cannot wait to be invited. You cannot put your hand halfway up and then pull it back down because the man at the front of the room has a belt buckle that wants to be silver and an expression like he's already decided how this ends. Curtis had pulled his hand down on her first day, and she understood why. She understood the specific arithmetic of risk that runs through a person's mind when they are 50 years old and need the job and have a truck with a bad axle, and she did not judge him for it. But she also knew that the writing in his manila folder had mattered, that the 4 years of quiet documentation had mattered, that the private refusal to let the wrong thing go entirely unrecorded had been its own form of not pulling your hand down all the way. You do what you can with what you have from where you are, and sometimes what you can do is enough. The partnership agreement between Adeline Ruth Mercer and Rowan James Hale regarding the operational and financial management of Iron Creek Ranch was drafted by Claire Ogilvy and reviewed by both parties and signed on a Tuesday morning in the main house office, which was fitting because Tuesdays were the most forgettable day of the week, and this story had started on a Tuesday and was now, on another Tuesday, ending in the way the best endings end, not with a bang, not with a dramatic declaration, but with two people signing their real names to an honest document that said what it meant. Rowan signed first. His signature was the same both times. She noticed that, and it mattered to her in a way she didn't try to explain. She signed second, Adeline Ruth Mercer, in the handwriting she'd had since she was 12 years old and a teacher had told her it was too small to read, which she had subsequently made no effort to change because she had decided even at 12 that readability was the reader's problem as much as the writer's. Claire witnessed it and shook both their hands and said she had a 2 o'clock in Billings and left with the efficiency of someone who had been in this building for good reasons twice now and hoped not to need a third visit for anything complicated. The office was quiet after she left. The new printer didn't make any sound. Outside, the yard was in the flat, clear light of a Montana morning in early November, the kind of light that has no warmth in it but is honest about that illuminates without flattering, which is the best kind of light for seeing things as they are. Rowan was looking at his copy of the signed agreement, not reading it, just looking at it. Your father would know what this is, she said. My father would say I took too long. You took exactly as long as it took to do it right. He looked at her. The expression on his face was one she had seen before, once, briefly, in the very early days. Not warmth exactly, more like the recognition of something actual, the look you get when you have been dealing in performances for so long that encountering something genuine feels startling. The east barn roof, he said. I put it in the capital plan. Spring. Before spring, he said. We had 2 inches of snow last week. Then before spring, she agreed, I'll revise the timeline. She picked up her notebook, the third one, half full, its pages organized with the same cross-referencing system as the first two, and opened it to the page where the barn roof estimate lived, and crossed out spring and wrote November, expedited, and moved to the next item on the list. Outside, the cattle were moving in the south field, unhurried, in the particular morning drift of animals that are where they're supposed to be. The 14 acres at the south boundary were Iron Creek land again. All 420 acres were Iron Creek land again. The books reflected what was real. Rowan Hale picked up his copy of the signed agreement, folded it once, and put it in the inside pocket of his jacket, close to him, the way you carry something you have waited a long time to hold. Adeline Mercer turned to the next page in her notebook and started writing.